Preserving the Palisades is a dramatic story. The sometimes breathtaking events surrounding their rescue are difficult to imagine today when we see their quiet, stately beauty. One of the best views of the cliffs is from the George Washington Bridge. The bridge is one of the busiest in the world. Over 60 million vehicles annually cross the span, linking New York and New Jersey. Approaching New Jersey, the magnificent Palisades come into view. They border the mighty Hudson River, sweeping upward for more than 500 feet in an almost unbroken 13-mile line. But in the 1800s, these precious cliffs were being destroyed. If not for the combined work and energy of a group of New Jersey clubwomen, dedicated philanthropists, and New York and New Jersey governors, Theodore Roosevelt and Foster Voorhees, the cliffs would be gone today. This is the story of the women and men who saved and preserved the Palisades. Using massive quantities of dynamite, the cliff face of the Palisades was being blasted by quarrymen for valuable gravel used to pave the streets and build the tall buildings of New York City. The gouging of the dynamite caused deep incursions. The beautiful cliffs were left scarred, their bases and walls resembling slag heaps.
Though not rare, the basalt of the Palisades is a very desirable stone for quarrymen looking for building stone, for building docks and breakwaters and cobblestone roads, because it's a dense rock and a heavy rock, and yet it cleaves easily into right-angled pieces.
The Palisades rock formations were created about 190 million years ago. This volcanic event caused a large amount of magma, or molten rock, to intrude between layers of softer sandstone and shale. Millions of years went by, and erosion whittled away at these surfaces, eventually revealing harder volcanic rock. The edge of this volcanic rock is what appears as the Palisades. The sheet of lava forming the rim of the cliffs seems to tilt slightly backward away from the river. As long vertical chunks fell during the millions of years in formation, the backward tilt remained, keeping them upright, displaying their characteristic sharp edge. The Ice Ages were the most recent sculptors of the Palisades cliffs as we see them today. During the Ice Ages, large glaciers, or walls of ice, were pushed down from the north, scraping over the ground here in northern New Jersey, including the Palisades, and whittling away much of the remnants of the sandstone and shale that had surrounded the underground volcanic rock. When the ice melted, the glaciers retreated. The Palisades were revealed in splendid form. The naturally fallen rock, accumulating over centuries at the base of the cliffs, was called talus. This was easily scooped onto barges and floated downriver to New York City docks. By the 1880s, though, the talus was all but gone. When this source was depleted, the quarrymen turned to newly invented dynamite to blast the cliff face for more gravel. The quarrying industry grew in intensity. Crushed rock was needed in great quantities to pave city streets and construct noted New York City buildings, like the trend-setting Flatiron Building. Before blasting began, the pristine cliffs were awesome in their stately splendor. Artist John Hill captures the soaring cliffs as a backdrop for the river, sailboats, and a steamship in the 1820s. William Guy Wall and John Williamson show the river and cliffs looking south. A view from Hastings, New York, directly across from the Palisades, depicts the abundance of pleasure in commercial boats plying the Hudson in a calm manner.
In Europe at this point, you had a very strong interest in the Alpine region, in the Alps. They were the aesthetic yardstick, the most beautiful places. And that, in a way, the Palisades were thought of as somewhat alpine, if I can use the place name of where we're sitting to say that it was called alpine, that you get a kind of sense of aesthetic continuity across the ocean.
The mystique surrounding the cliffs grew over the centuries. The Native Americans enjoyed hunting the land and fishing the waters. Reluctantly, they moved west, ahead of the Europeans, shortly after the discovery by Henry Hudson and his half-moon. This mystery and attraction of the cliffs spread rapidly to the Old World, as seen by artists and writers. Awesome, sometimes moody paintings contributed to the cliffs' charm.
Palisades are a unique landscape. They, in many ways, fulfill the criteria, the aesthetic criteria of the Romantic Sublime, by which I mean they meet very well the criteria of being dramatic, irregular, stark, perhaps even barren, desolate, perhaps sometimes even slightly grotesque, all of which were the values that people who partook of the Romantic aesthetic shared.
As commerce grew, the top of the cliffs became the setting for homes of the wealthy and magnificent hotels, such as the famous Palisades Mountain House. This impressive building drew affluent patrons from now burgeoning New York City. The hotel would burn to the ground in a spectacular fire in 1884. The cliffs would continue to inspire artists and writers.
Also at this time, the Hudson River School of Painting became famous, became well known and respected, and people that were viewing these paintings also wanted to see this area. So they would book a journey, they would come to America, and this was often termed the Grand Tour.
Much of the shore on both sides of the river in the 1800s was pastoral and rustic in nature. The river fostered a great deal of commercial traffic. The port of Yonkers, looking north toward Tallman Mountain, shows busy wharfs. Many of these steamers continued upriver to Albany and Troy, connecting with the Hudson Highlands and Catskill region. Both commercial and sport fishing thrived on the river. This sketch by an artist from the Valentine Manual, done in 1897, shows a leaping sturgeon as an indication of the abundant marine life existing at the time. The Palisades and small fishing boats are drawn in the background. The recreational nature of the river began to change in the late 1880s as the early experiments with dynamite blasting became more practiced. Dozens of quarries sprung up along the shoreline of the cliffs. Among the busiest blasting the cliffs were Brown and Fleming, Gallagher's, and Carpenter's, located north of the present site of the George Washington Bridge. The cliffs began to be systematically blasted. The more fragile and exquisite Palisades formations were the first to go. Many of these delicate pillars of rock, some balanced on the edge of the cliffs in Weehawken, New Jersey, fell early to the quarrying efforts. Many, like the aptly named Dome Rock, were easily toppled by strategically placed dynamite. Others, reminiscent of poetically named Profile Rock, carved by the Ice Age over centuries, disappeared into rubble. Perhaps the most well-known formation, called Indian Head, was blown up in an enormous blast. This particular event enraged the public, and a prominent New York businessman, George Walbridge Perkins. Perkins lived at beautiful Wave Hill in Riverdale. An early environmentalist, he enjoyed the scenic cliffs across the Hudson. His concern grew as he watched the puffs of dynamite smoke and crumbling rock increase every day. The noise now began to awaken his infant son. But the blasting continued, and huge chunks of rock were dislodged, such as this house-sized piece, just fallen, with the quarry worker viewing the remains. Public alarm began to grow as the leading New York newspapers featured stories and prominent headlines. Ordinary citizens, as well as other wealthy residents on New York's upscale Riverside Drive, began to protest the loss of their delightful view. Andrew H. Green, founder of the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society, roused this group to oppose the quarrying. Members living on the New York side of the river could plainly see the destruction of the cliffs. One indignant resident of Englewood, New Jersey, particularly noted the devastation. Miss Elizabeth Vermilya, then president of the newly formed Women's Club of Englewood, was appalled at the destruction. The blasting was occurring practically in her wealthy family's backyard. She began a plan involving the women's clubs to stand in opposition.
Elizabeth was really a born naturalist. As a young child, she used to wander up and hike up the hill of Palisade Avenue, which is quite a hill. That's the western side of the Palisades. She would hike up to the top of the edge of the Palisades and loved the huge trees that were there in those days, and of course the vista from the very top, all down, up and down the Hudson River. And she would look across to New York and think how lucky and fortunate they were over there to be able to see her Palisades and her cliffs. And of course Elizabeth, who had been there up walking around and admiring all of that natural wonder all those years, was horrified every time she would hear a dynamite blast. It actually reverberated more over to the New York side because of the wall of the Palisades stopped it from coming westward toward Englewood itself. But everyone knew when a blast was going off. And over the years, the blasting became more and more intense as more dynamite men became more adept and skilled at blasting.
At Elizabeth's request, the Englewood Club issued an invitation to women's clubs all over the state to attend a meeting directly addressing the issue of the Palisades' destruction. The meeting took place at a large auditorium in Englewood called the Lyceum. This building still stands, now home to a bank.
The significance of the campaign to save the Palisades can best be most clearly seen, I think, by dividing the movement into its components. That is, to look at it as an example not only of scenic conservation, but also of the emergence in the United States at the turn of the century of citizen activism as an important part of middle and upper class life, that you get a quickening of what I would call almost associationalism around the turn of the century. That is, people who want to form and belong to nonprofit citizen groups that perform a civic function. Civic life was important at the turn of the century. Sometimes in a way I think that we might forget that there were many people, particularly women, who were members of many organizations at the turn of the century and very active. And I think this is symbolic of that kind of activism. It is also, I think, symbolic of the important role that philanthropy played and would continue to play in the American environmental movement. And though people tend to think of the state and the private philanthropic or activist sectors as separate, the truth of the matter is they emerge together, very much working in concert with the state being strongly supportive of citizen activism, and of course citizens and philanthropists very much supporting the development of the administrative state.
The women departed for their meeting at the Lyceum at the Englewood train station and were taken by carriage a short distance on Palisade Avenue, the main route to town, to the Lyceum. The clothing of the day was particularly cumbersome. Long skirts, parasols, and bustles made travel difficult. Mrs. Ida Dawson, a New Jersey clubwoman in the 1890s, wears the typical dress. The women came from all over the state to hear and learn about the destruction of the Palisades. One woman, the president of the State Federation of Women's Clubs, Cecilia Gaines, would have a significant effect on the battle to save the Palisades.
At that meeting, Miss Gaines gave a welcoming talk. She was very graceful, as you can imagine. And She thanked the Women's Club of Englewood for entertaining the board. And then there were various speakers as well as many entertainers at that meeting. But the whole program for that meeting was dedicated to saving the Palisades. And that was because at that point, Elizabeth Vermillion was the president of the Women's Club of Englewood. And it was the first time that the whole state board of women's clubs, as well as guests, other members who lived around the state, had an opportunity to hear firsthand, and it's much easier to understand there's a problem when you hear firsthand about the problem than when you read something in a report.
The energy generated at the meeting was intense. During the reading of her paper about the destruction of the Palisades, Mrs. Catherine Suzad, an Englewood clubwoman, proclaimed,
"Which shall overawe the stoutest lobbyist."
The women present took this as a battle cry and left the meeting to bring the subject back to club members statewide. At this point, New Jersey and New York legislatures were becoming involved. New York Governor Theodore Roosevelt was quite familiar with the Palisades. He was a member of the Englewood, New Jersey Rod and Gun Club. He's pictured purportedly posing with the club. The blasting continued, actually within earshot of the meeting at the Lyceum. As the intensity of the blasting increased, so did the profits. Carpenter's quarry was earning $1,500 daily. The dollar equivalent for that amount in today's money would be $28,000. Motivation on the part of the quarrymen and their lobbying effort was considerable. Thousands of tons of rock were now blasted every day. Dozens of barges were lined up at makeshift piers to receive the gravel and take it to construction sites across the river. The quarrying companies built dirt roads that crisscrossed the Palisades so the gravel could be hauled to the waiting barges. The magnificent cliffs were all but destroyed in places.
As a result of the organizing efforts of the two women of the Women's Federation Club, Elizabeth Vermillion and Celia Gaines Holland, they created a frenzy within the state to save the cliffs. They embarked on letter-writing campaigns. They went to every one of their legislators. They went to every newspaper editorial board that they could find. And before you knew it, there was an enormous effort, and everyone was saying, we must save the cliffs.
Politicians and legislators in the New Jersey State House began to pay attention to the public clamor, especially Governor Foster Voorhees. Although, when some of the club women visited him, he told them,
"Ladies, I have tried to save the Palisades for 10 years. It is an impossible task."
Undaunted, members of the women's clubs throughout the state embarked on a huge letter-writing and publicity campaign. At this time, there were 72 women's clubs, with approximately 12,000 members. That number was considerable at the time, and they were organized. Other organizations, such as the Historic and Scenic Societies with noted philanthropists, took significant interest in the devastation of the cliffs. They set out on the river to view the quarry companies blasting. The next strategy the club women employed was to join these other groups interested in saving the cliffs aboard a yacht sailing up the Hudson. The press was so taken by the women's presence that the World newspaper sent a reporter and published a sketch of the women meeting on the deck of the Marietta. Cecilia Gaines told the reporters,
"Men may legislate, but women can agitate."
The boat trip up the Hudson generated immense publicity. Indeed, the publisher of the World newspaper, William Dana, could see and hear the blasting from his cliff-top mansion. The novelty of a group of 40 club women making the journey and conducting meetings on deck was of great interest to the reading public. Saving the Palisades had now become a national issue. Cecilia Gaines followed the 1897 boat trip, traveling to a meeting of the General Federation of Women's Clubs in Denver, Colorado in 1898. In presenting a paper on the issue, she enlisted the support of 1 million club women nationwide. Part of her address contained a call to action.
You can help us to rouse national indignation at this wanton destruction. You can stand behind us. a great force of public opinion stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And we women of New Jersey will do all in our power to preserve the fairest jewel of the Hudson to the future generations of America.
Gaines returned to convene the New Jersey Federation Convention in Elizabeth, New Jersey, hosted by the women's clubs of Elizabeth and Rahway on September 27th and 28th, 1898. A report of the Denver meeting and the condition of the Palisades was on the agenda. At this convention, some additional national support was present in the person of invited guest, Mrs. Julia Ward Howe, author of the popular Battle Hymn of the Republic. Gaines remembered her stirring presence in later years during an address to a convention of women's clubs she gave in the 1930s.
During my presidency, I had an experience I shall never forget. Standing with my arm around Julia Ward Howe to support her, as she was then past 80, while she recited the finest national hymn we have, the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Indeed, Cecilia Gaines Holland left more than one memory. Her writings and pictures can be seen today at the State Federation headquarters. This is situated on the campus of Douglas College in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Her precious journal details a record of the efforts of the club women in saving the cliffs.
The early leaders of the Federation were very diligent in their record keeping. We're very grateful to them for their diligence. Because of that, we have a rich history of what happened in the early years of the Federation that we can look at. Cecilia Gaines Holland, who is our second state president, kept this journal of the activities of the Federation while we were attempting to save the Palisades. It contains pictures and letters and photographs of the events that were going on at the time we were saving the Palisades. Today, every club keeps a scrapbook of the activities through the year, of the newspaper clippings and of the letters that they receive and of photographs. And every state president has a scrapbook given to her at the end of her term of office of what happened during her term as well, so that we continue the tradition started by Cecilia Gaines.
Armed with the enthusiasm generated at the 1898 convention, the club women intensified the letter writing and speaking campaign. The women became active lobbyists themselves. The letters came from all over the state of New Jersey, and they were now joined by clubs in New York and across the nation.
The women really gave us a wonderful model of how to organize for the purposes of conservation. And in fact, the Palisades Interstate Park Commission exists today in large part because of the women's group. We are eternally grateful for them. The organizing, the letter writing, the going to the legislators, the constant day in and day out thinking and talking and writing and using every opportunity possible to bring into people of importance vision the Palisades and how such a natural beauty should not be taken for granted and should not be ignored and certainly should not be blown to smithereens, is what the ladies did. Eventually, others, Perkins, Governor Voorhees, Governor Roosevelt, picked it up and ran with it. But it was the women who organized it, the women who brought it into people's consciousness, the women who made it happen.
The publicity they generated with their particularly refined approach was having significant effect. The State House was now deluged with support from all segments of society for saving the cliffs.
As a result of all of the publicity, that now was quite a resounding everyday drama unfolding on the cliffs and in the newspapers. Governor Voorhees did two unprecedented things, actually. He started a fact-finding commission to report to him on the condition of the Palisades. And in addition, he appointed two women, and we all know who those two women were, Celia Holland and Elizabeth Vermilye. This was unprecedented because, remember, women didn't even have the right to vote at this point.
This commission recommended buying the Carpenter's Brothers Quarry, one of the busiest, near the present site of the George Washington Bridge. Money generated by the two states was enhanced through private sources, including a last-minute donation by prominent financier J.P. Morgan. The deal was made, and blasting stopped on Christmas Eve 1900. The Palisades were saved. More work needed to be done to secure the other operating quarries and preserve the cliffs. To accomplish this, the Palisades Interstate Park Commission was founded in 1900. During the early preservation period, enormous contributions were made by some notable families, like the Perkins, the Harrimans, and the Rockefellers. The newly formed Palisades Interstate Park Commission set about buying land along the shoreline with visions of establishing a park. Early focus was on this land abutting the cliff face. Potential for recreation centered on the water, establishing bathing beaches and small boat launch sites. A large camping community developed at what is now Ross Dock, almost on the exact site of the Carpenters Brothers Quarry, in the shadow of where the George Washington Bridge would be built. A short distance north, Bloomer's Beach, located at the present Englewood Boat Basin, and Forest View in Alpine welcomed bathers from both New Jersey and New York. Any manner of small craft made these two destinations a common area for enjoyment. The beaches and picnic grounds became so popular, a commercial ferry service was begun from Dyckman Street in New York to Englewood, New Jersey. As the land was purchased along the shore stretching from New Jersey into New York, money from both states was utilized. Formation of the new interstate organization, the Palisades Interstate Park Commission in 1900, was a landmark innovation. The unprecedented contribution of revenue by one state to buy and preserve land in another state was unique. Hiking continues to be a favorite of the visitors today, as it was over 100 years ago. People of all ages come from the tri-state area and beyond to enjoy the many trails. This 19th century woodcut shows a lone hiker climbing the more familiar Palisades formations. As these pleasant activities ranged around the seasons, the Palisades Park Commissioners, led by the first president, George Walbridge Perkins Sr., began to develop a grander vision. Preservation meant purchase, and purchase was setting precedent for other conservation movements.
We're talking basically about the late 19th, turn of the century, turn of the 20th century period, and saying that a great many people were concerned about the environment, even though they didn't use the word environment or environmentalism. People tended to use a different kind of language, which involved the word conservation and the word preservation, the preservation of natural or scenic or wild areas. These things combined both the notion of beauty and the notion of wishing to use land wisely, resources wisely, that there was an awareness that protecting a watershed was both important to the animals, to the people who wanted to use it for recreational reasons or scenic, enjoy the scenic view. It was also important to protect the watersheds of the cities for a water supply, so that something like the Adirondacks combined both this awareness that you need to protect the watershed along with the idea of wishing to provide open scenic areas.
Another interest group was formed in 1900 to assist in preserving the Great Cliffs. Two heroines of the crusade to save the Palisades and members of the very first commission, Elizabeth Vermilye and Cecilia Gaines Holland, retained their enormous interest and energy toward the future of the Palisades. This group began to raise money for improvements to the park and, significantly, to construct a monument marking the achievement in saving the cliffs. This goal would be realized in 1929. The commission set about what they believed as their main goal to complete purchase of all shore properties. This was almost accomplished during the first few years of the agency's inception. There were no precedents to follow. The only other natural sites purchased by government entities were Niagara Falls and early interest in Yellowstone Park. The commission, now armed with continuous appropriations from New York and New Jersey, had bought almost all the essential properties between the cliff edge and the high water mark. Preparations were being made to dedicate the park. This was held at the old Cornwallis headquarters, now Blackledge Carney House, on the edge of the river in Alpine, New Jersey. On September 27, 1909, New York Governor Charles Evans Hughes and New Jersey Governor J. Franklin Fort accepted the park on behalf of both states. The commission was now running a park. Shortly after, in 1910, Mary Harriman, widow of E.H. Harriman, announced an outstanding gift to the park. Mrs. Harriman proposed a gift of 10,000 acres and $1 million, comprising what is now known as Harriman State Park. As a young man, Averell Harriman presented the $1 million check to George Perkins, who was president of the Palisades Interstate Park Commission. David Mortimer, pictured here as a young boy at a park ceremony with his grandfather, Governor Averell Harriman, describes this gift.
By 1909, E.H. Harriman had amassed an estate of approximately 30,000 acres in Orange County, New York. And as he's quoted as saying that it was more land than he needed. So he and George Perkins, the man who's probably more responsible for saving the Palisades than any other individual, worked out an arrangement by which E.H. would donate 10,000 acres of his estate and $1 million to help establish a state park. Unfortunately, E.H. didn't live to see this come true. He died in September of 1909. However, his wife, his widow, Mary W. Harriman, took up the cause and wrote a letter to New York State Governor Charles Evans Hughes and proposed the donation of 10,000 acres and $1 million to help establish the state park.
At this time, Perkins initiated building the Bear Mountain Inn. Meanwhile, the women of the Federation continued their efforts to erect a suitable monument, marking the achievement of saving the cliffs. The deliberations of the commission, which had begun to focus on the clifftop lands, were jolted into expediency with the planning and building of the George Washington Bridge. Started in 1926, the span was expected to be finished in 1931. A land development bonanza was anticipated, with full exploitation of the Palisades and environs a prime target.
In July of 1933, John D. Rockefeller Jr. made an amazing announcement. He declared and told everyone that for a period of years he had been anonymously buying 700 acres on top of the cliffs that stretched in the north from State Line down past what is now the George Washington Bridge. So 700 acres at a cost of $9.5 million somehow miraculously had been protected.
These purchases had two noble goals: to save the clifftop and to provide Rockefeller's newly constructed museum, the Cloisters, with a magnificent westerly view across the Hudson River. The Cloisters Tower stands almost as a sentinel overlooking the river and the cliffs. The museum contains a marvelous collection of medieval statuary and art, including the world-famous unicorn tapestries. The treasures of the Old World had come in effect to be enhanced by the natural beauty of the New World. Lovely views of the cliffs are seen from water level. An example is viewed from the deck of the New Jersey tall ship A.J. Meerwald.
We're on the A.J. Meerwald in the Hudson River just off the Palisades. And the conservation of these magnificent scene of the Palisades is really has a lot to do with Teddy Roosevelt's term as governor of New York. He, in 1900, signed the legislation establishing the Palisades Interstate Park Commission, which set aside the lands of the Palisades in New Jersey for conservation purposes. This was Teddy's first act of public act of conservation, and he went on to do 125 million acres across the country as president.
As the park develops, the commissioners continue to protect the natural wonders and spectacular vistas.
On this beautiful afternoon, we are standing in area known as Federation Park. I'm standing atop the Women's Tower in the park, which was constructed and dedicated in April of 1929 to recognize the efforts of those women who participated in the early stages of the formation of the Palisade Interstate Park Commission. It's particularly appropriate that we're here as an exemplification of a concept that existed over 100 years ago and is very much in vogue today in the environmental movement throughout the United States. It's known as ridgeline or visual integrity. The point of the matter is that this park is an example of how not only the river was saved, not only the shoreline, not only the Palisades themselves, but the very tops of the lands and the cliffs themselves. The point is that the land south of here and north of here, and you'll notice they're complementing the beauty of the river, was all part of the whole vision that these people had over 100 years ago, and yet today it's very much a part of the thought process involved in this movement today. And the nice part about it, I guess, is that for the past 100 years and for tens of years to come, people will enjoy this for future generations.
As the park continued to expand, many projects were proposed so that the public would better enjoy its beauty. A road was constructed connecting the Englewood and Alpine sections, opening on October 29, 1921. An entrance from the top of the Palisades at both Englewood and Alpine was part of this initiative. When begun in 1916, it was one of the earliest roads constructed for scenic beauty in the United States. This road exists in almost the original form today. Work had now begun on the monument. The women's clubs had raised an impressive $3,000. The building was constructed of Palisades trap rock to resemble a watchtower. The purpose, in addition to commemoration, was to guard the landscape so far preserved. It was finally dedicated on April 30th, 1929. Records indicate that a crowd of over 300 persons attended. The program contained selections by the Brass and Horn All-Woman Aida Quartet. The plaque unveiled that day read, "This Federation Park and this structure are dedicated to the successful efforts of the New Jersey State Federation of Women's Clubs and of those men and women who aided in the opening years of the 20th century in preserving these Palisades cliffs from destruction, for the glory of God who created them and the ennobling of the generations which may henceforth enjoy them." Another monument would be completed in 1934, much farther upriver, high on the summit of Bear Mountain, Perkins Tower, a memorial to George Walbridge Perkins Sr., was built having a commanding view of the Hudson Highlands. The George Washington Bridge would be completed, providing a grandeur of a different sort. The span leaps from the cliffs like some giant flying buttress. The towers loft over the cliffs, topping out at 600 feet above the surface of the river, all to be enjoyed and used without harming the impressive northerly Palisades view. One of the most recent additions to the park is the magnificent Bear Mountain merry-go-round. This gift was presented to the park by Anne Perkins Cabot, a park commissioner. It's dedicated to the memory of her father, George Walbridge Perkins Jr., and her mother, Lynn Merck Perkins.
I'm sitting here in front of the fireplace in the merry-go-round, where the dedication through the merry-go-round to my mother and father, George W. Perkins and Lynn Merck Perkins, who believed in philanthropy, as I do, and we all want to continue to help people and the park.
The animals featured on the carousel are those natural to the park: red fox, deer, raccoon, and bear. The ride is enjoyed by children of all ages.
And this horse happens to be my favorite horse, who's modeled after my own horse. His name is Jetsam.
The Palisades Interstate Park Commission continues in vigilance over the 100,000 acres, with a view toward helping to save and preserve even more open space, such as the stretch of highlands from the Adirondacks through the Berkshires to the Appalachian Mountains. The Palisades Interstate Park Commission has many permanent markers to reinforce its resolve. The stone towers along the river's summits. They act almost in the capacity of guardians, standing watchful witness to a promise of protection for the grand vistas. The Cloisters Tower, the Women's Monument, and Perkins Tower.